Good afternoon, everybody. Tom, can you hear me okay?
I can.
Alrighty, perfect. So welcome everybody to another week of our COVID-19 Town Hall series that we have going on. Like you've seen up on the screen for the past couple minutes, please remember to use the call-in code as sometimes the internet over computer audio option hasn't been working for us, and to minimize the feedback that we're getting on your end as well. So here are our lovely speakers and panelists with an addition of a few new faces that we'll introduce later. We have Kristi Weierbach for workforce, Phil Keeney with technology, Tom Mao for regulatory, Chad Bumbaugh and Steve Snyder under cash flow, and Katie Boshniak for human resources. Just a few housekeeping items before I move into the agenda slide and then pass it off to Tom. You can customize what you're seeing on the screen right now by just going to the GoToWebinar Screen Viewer tab in your GoToWebinar panel. All attendees will stay muted throughout this entire presentation, and we are doing a Q&A section at the end of this PowerPoint and presentation, and we just ask that you code your questions with the following buckets, just so we can help our panelists manage questions more efficiently. Those are workforce, technology, regulatory, cash flow, and human resources. There is a slide deck available for download in the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel. If you have trouble viewing that, press the View tab at the top of your panel, and you should be able to check the box to view the handout portion. And again, if you're experiencing audio issues, please use the dial-in option that coordinates with your registration rather than the computer audio. And just a note and a small disclaimer here that all the information that is being presented today is based on what we know as of 2:01 p.m. on April 14th, 2020, as this entire situation remains a fluid situation, and hopefully we'll be able to make sure that is concrete in the next coming weeks. Just a few next steps. Our next town hall is Tuesday, April 21st, same time, same place. We will be sending a reminder email out to you to join that. And to visit our COVID-19 section of our website for any additional insight and information pertaining to our past webinars, any information that we are able to push out in a brochure type of way, etc., is going to be all out on that page for you. And just the last note here to reach out to us via our website on our contact page. Our website is stambaughness.com. And last but not least, just an overview of our agenda today. After our housekeeping items, we're going to go into our 30, 60, 90-day approach to reentry. We're going to do our typical COVID-19 update with cash flow, workforce, and regulatory updates today. We're going to take a peek into our anticipatory organization, kind of what a future view will be for the next couple weeks and months. We are also going to hold something new to our COVID Town Hall series, which is going to be our roundtable the next 30 days. That's where you're going to see some new faces enter into our panelist section there. And then we're going to finish with our typical Q&A portion. So with that, Tom?
Well, hello and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us again this week. It's hard to believe it's almost been a month now since basically most of the country has been in this situation on lockdown. But we're making our way through it. Hopefully everyone had a nice holiday weekend this past weekend as best you could in these different circumstances, and that you're all hanging in there. We're seeing some good signs, I think, some good news slowly but surely starting to come out that we might be reaching the summit and coming down the other side of this crisis. So please keep doing everything you've been doing with the social distancing and following all the instructions, and we'll all get over this together. So again, as Kaylee said, we're going to be with you here for 2 hours this afternoon. We've got some new things planned for you today, but certainly I can't emphasize enough the comment Kaylee made about this being a fluid situation. We always kind of joke about news coming out right down to the wire on these events, and I think when Chad jumps into his section here today on cash flow and loans, you're going to hear about some things To the best we can figure it out, that just came out really even within the last hour, and that's on the Paycheck Protection Program loans. So we may not certainly be experts on that yet because the news is very fresh, but we'll do our best to bring that out for you. So as Kaylee said, we'll have our usual updates. We're going to be a little bit shorter this week with those since not quite as much happened over the last week, but we know a lot of you certainly have interest in things like the Paycheck Protection Program. The Main Street Loan Program came out this past week. Things continue to change on the workforce side, especially around unemployment benefits. We're going to talk about that. I've got a couple of updates for you on the tax side, not a whole lot, but there were still a couple of significant things this past week. And we're certainly monitoring any sort of future relief efforts. We keep hearing about possibly a phase 4. We keep our fingers crossed that more dollars will be allocated to the Paycheck Protection Program as well. So we'll be telling you all about that as we get into future weeks. But one of the things we start doing today is start looking into the future, and that's why we brought some other panelists on today and are going to have the roundtable a little bit later. As the company does reopen for business, we want to kind of walk you through what we think might be a 30, 60, 90-day approach, things that are vital for you to do in those first 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. Today, we're going to concentrate on the first 30 days. We hope you join us again in the next 2 weeks, as next week we'll look at the 60-day plan, and then the following week, the 90-day plan. We certainly are seeing some good signs here. I know yesterday, a coalition of governors in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeastern states all met to talk about how to reopen their states for business. And I found that encouraging because in a lot of those, whether it's New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, or some of the places hardest hit by this pandemic. So if they're starting to talk about the other side, I take that as a really good sign. And I think we all need to start getting ready for that. So I'm not going to talk any more about the concept right here, but you're certainly going to hear a lot more from some of our other speakers a little bit later this afternoon. So as Kaylee said, certainly reach out to us at any time. Call or email your Stambaugh Ness rep. Use that contact page at our website. We want to answer any question you have, or at least do our best to do so. Keep an eye on all of our channels, whether that's email or website, social media. Check out the events page at our website. That's where you can see past versions of the town hall, as well as other webinars that we've completed before. And we also will be placing on there upcoming events that are coming down the pike for us. So as we have said before, we've got these sessions planned to the end of April at least. If there's a need to do them beyond that, we certainly will do so. So I think that's all for my introduction. We're going to get right into it. I'm going to pass it off to Chad Bumbaugh, who's going to talk to us about some issues regarding cash flow and the various loan programs. So Chad, it's all yours.
All right. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. And as Tom alluded to, in a minute or two, I'm going to get on cover some topics that literally came out sometime this afternoon. I found out about it about a half hour ago and did a quick read as best I could, and I'll provide some brief updates for those that have Schedule Cs and partnerships. Definitely want to stay tuned for that item. But just real quick, I want to give you an update on where we kind of stand with the PPP programs right now, and a couple other items. As of the close of business yesterday, around 1 million loans have been processed by the SBA, and roughly $242 billion of funds have been awarded, and that's around $350 billion total funds. So we are down to about the last third on the initial funds that were allocated. So, you know, there is certainly a sizable chunk of funds left, but they are getting spoken for. So if you don't have your applications in, again, certainly it's something we encourage you to address now because additional funding is not guaranteed. We are also hearing that some of the EIDL grants, the $10,000 grants, are being received, and also some early PPP funds are starting to hit bank accounts. So we're not seeing that with the masses yet, but we are starting to see some early recipients, which is good. So a couple of things that we just wanted to touch upon around the PPP in general is, you know, there is a 10-day rule to take the loans once the SBA approves it. And really, you're at the mercy of the bank in terms of how the loan is funded and the timing of that mechanism. So while the loans documents and the program say 10 days, the bank may ask you to come to the table to settle a little earlier. And why is this important? Well, when you get those funds is when you start the 8-week window for the forgiveness measurements. So again, the guidance is 10 days, but banks seem to be applying a little bit of their own rules in regards to that, and we suggest you follow and talk with your bank specifically on those items. I did also want to mention, and I'm going to really condense this because of the news that just came out here, is the Treasury did clarify a couple items about the affiliation rules since we last spoke. That impacts really entities that are under common control and things like that in regards to eligibility. So I don't think that's the majority of our audience or a significant portion, but I want to mention and point you to the interim final rule on affiliations if you want to review that for the latest and greatest on how those rules in the PPP program intersect. But the one I do want to spend a couple minutes on is, as Tom mentioned, is literally hot off the presses, and this is guidance on Schedule C's, partnerships, and how the PPP loan program is going to interact with those entities. The timing of this is a little bit later than I think we had hoped. The guidance came out, or the applications began being accepted for these entities on April 10th. So we're still a little bit behind on getting the rules before the game has started to be played, but we're getting a little more timely. If you're interested, this is on the Treasury's home site on the additional eligibility criteria and requirements for certain pledges of loans documents. If you want to read the details, I'm going to give you some highlights. They're in that document on the Treasury site. So a couple key things. Partners and partnerships cannot apply separately. We had originally talked about potentially partners and partnerships being able to apply as a self-employed individual. This document makes it clear that they are not to do that. Their guaranteed payments are to be included in the payroll cost of the partnership at this point. Really, that's to reduce the number of loans being applied for. So it's more of an administrative thing than anything. So for purposes of PPP, guaranteed payments are equivalent to payroll costs. So it kind of makes sense theoretically, but it's a little bit different than what we're used to on the tax side. On the Schedule C, how do we go about measuring the loan availability amounts and also the forgiveness? That's really going to be driven by your net profits on your Schedule C itself. So line 31 of your Schedule C divided by 12, this is the 2019 Schedule C, and that's going to be important in just a minute, divided by 12 and then times the 2.5 months. So that's your maximum loan amount. A couple notes on that is you are going to be required to file to the bank a 2019 Schedule C for the purposes of a loan determination, even if you've not yet filed your tax return. And that 2019 Schedule C is really going to drive a number of aspects of the loan for Schedule C individuals. So they want to see that form, even if the tax return is not yet filed. Again, there's really no guidance to mention if there's a final reconciliation or what that may look like on the back end, but I would assume that they would do a final check on the forgiveness. They also want to see documentation to prove that you were in business both last year and as of February 15th, 2020. So they're looking for things like 1099 miscellaneouses, bank statements, books and records, invoices to your customers, things like that to prove that you are, in fact, a business. So what can the funds be used for as a Schedule C? And again, much of this is consistent with what I think we had guessed it would be, but it's nice to see it in writing. So the Schedule C funds for a PPP can be used for the owner's compensation. And again, that's going to be based off the 2019 Schedule C profits divided by 12 on a monthly basis and then times the 2.5 months. Mortgage loan interest, rent, utilities, and other items similar to the businesses that were applying with the initial round. And again, you do have to look to that 2019 Schedule C because they are not going to allow you to claim expenses against the PPP that you did not take on last year's Schedule C. So you can't all of a sudden now begin charging rent and utilities to the Schedule C to maximize your PPP loan. And then the forgiveness calculation is going to be based on 8/52 of the 2019 net profit. Again, the 8-week measurement period divided by the 52 weeks in a year. And they're going to use that to determine the owner's compensation. So really that 2019 Schedule C becomes critical to drive this entire equation. The rest of the forgiveness calculations, the 75% rule and the other items are really the same as we had talked about earlier, so I won't get into those details. But in a nutshell, that is the synopsis of a document that's about an hour or so old. Again, I apologize if I missed anything. One last item I did want to hit on. Schedule C health insurance and retirement plans for the owners is a little bit different. That's not on the Schedule C on the tax return, and what we're reading is those items really are kind of outside of the equation right now as we see it. Again, I'm not sure if that's the intent of the legislation as it's written, or if that's something that they're going to provide further guidance down the road. But right now, it does not seem that the Schedule C owners, the proprietors' health insurance and retirement is factored in. But if you do have a Schedule C that has employees, those amounts are factored in as they have been for all businesses to date. So that is the latest and greatest, and that was much anticipated by certain individuals. The other thing I want to hit on, and Kayla, if you can move the slide to the document about the Main Street Loan Program, if you don't mind. Thank you. So since we last chatted, there was a new program announced by the Federal Reserve, and that's going to provide some lending capacity for individuals who maybe could not take advantage of the PPP loan for various reasons. And there's a couple different types of loan facilities with this program: Main Street New Loan, Main Street Expanded Loan. I'm going to try to just focus on some of the key points here. I know we want to focus on the future here today, but I want to make sure everybody is aware of what's available to them as well. So again, these loans are for businesses that did not necessarily apply or were not eligible for the PPP. But it is important to note that if you are eligible for both, you are able to take both the PPP and, if you need it, the Main Street Loan Program. I think it's important to note that there is no forgiveness portion to the Main Street Loan Program. This is more of a traditional SBA loan, and I just want to set the stage so that there isn't any misconception there as we talk through these terms. So who's eligible for a Main Street Loan Program? The small and mid-sized businesses, up to 10,000 employees, up to $2.5 billion in annual revenues. So their definition of small and mid-sized might be a little different than some of ours, but it captures, what they consider the middle market employers. And again, these must be U.S. businesses with the majority of the employees based in the United States. The loan terms are going to be 4-year unsecured loans. P&I, principal and interest payments, are deferred for a year. The minimum loan size is $1 million. The maximum loan size is up to $25 million, or 4 times an adjusted EBITDA calculation. So they take the loan amount, look at your EBITDA, and look to see basically your borrowing capacity. The interest rate's at a market rate plus 250 to 400 basis points, so they're not as favorable as the 1% PPP loans, but still, reasonably affordable cost of funds. No prepayment penalties. Again, no forgiveness. I want to stress that topic. And if you already have some existing Main Street loan programs, there are some limitations as to what you can and can't apply for in relation to this program. Again, I won't get into those details, as I think the PPP is really what's going to be the first and most sought after loan program for most individuals and businesses. A couple other quick things on the Main Street program. You cannot use those funds to repay or prepay existing lines and loans of credit. And there are certain limitations that I think are a little more restricted than the PPP funds that are required here, and there are also some attestations the business owner must make. So again, it's much more in line with traditional SBA funding and other funding sources. There are some certain items that we have to test to in terms of conflict of interest and other items that is required under the Main Street Loan Program. So it's something to be aware of. If your PPP funding is not sufficient to meet your needs, it's definitely another avenue worth at least a look. So the last item I have before I turn it back over to Kristi for some updates on the workforce front is just the PPP forgiveness. It's still a question that we're hearing a lot. What does this look like? What are the specifics? Unfortunately, the guidance I was hoping that we would see this afternoon was an FAQ that would hit upon the details of the forgiveness that I could share that with you today. Did not get that, unfortunately, yet. So there has not been any substantive changes from where we were last week. We have seen some more non-authoritative guidance, so I'm going to, just hold that until I see something from the Treasury. But we certainly see this is something that we're going to hear more about in the near term. It's been speculated that this week we're likely to see the FAQ on the forgiveness. So stay tuned on that front. But what we are suggesting is, start thinking about that forgiveness period. As I mentioned earlier, the cash is starting to come in on these PPP loans. So what is it going to look like? How are we going to use the funds? When are we going to bring our people back to maximize the forgiveness and try to thread the needle in terms of maximizing what we're able to have subsidized through the government loan program? So what we've been doing now is we have actually have a model built, and we're engaging in discussions with some clients about the strategies around that and what that might look like. And that's something really, that's the first 30-day tip that I'll share today is look at that forgiveness if you've been approved for a loan and the clock's going to start if it hasn't already, is start to model that and what that looks like. And you'll hear a little bit more later today about what we can be doing with the folks that we're bringing back to position ourselves for that restart. But once it's funded and we know they have the PPP money, we think that's the next step. So with that, that's really all that I had in terms of the update. So I'm going to turn it over to Kristi for the workforce items. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chad. Appreciate the updates. And hello, everyone. It's nice to spend the next couple hours with you today. So I don't have a lot. I'm only going to take a couple minutes with you and then kick it over to Tom for some regulatory updates. Unemployment continues to be a hot topic as we think about employees who are still waiting, in some cases, for that initial payment or haven't seen the full payment as to when they initially filed and so forth. So yes, I have seen specifically in Pennsylvania, the movement is happening. It seems like that bottleneck has broken loose a little bit. And so people who had filed in the third week or so of March, they are getting their payments. They probably have seen it started last week or this week. Initially, Pennsylvania sends out a PIN and then sends out financial determination, and then the check or direct deposit occurs shortly thereafter. So what's not included in that is the federal portion, that additional $600. That will be deposited or given to the individual who claimed unemployment separately, and so they can expect to see that separate. It will continue to be separate. They actually are creating another area on the website, which hasn't been made available yet, for people to take a look at that and so forth. So we really are just waiting on additional details about that. Next week, I'm pretty confident we'll be able to provide an update on that. So yeah, the $600 is really attractive on top of the normal unemployment. Clients have reached out saying, well, I think my employee's going to make out better on unemployment. So what's the incentive to come back to work? And quite honestly, it is attractive. But if employees are making the right choices, they will come back to work when it is ready and able. If you, as the employee or employer, are finding that employees are refusing to come back to work, they might say, I'm scared, or, hey, I'm going to stay on unemployment longer. I'm getting paid. Why should I, take the risk of coming into a place where I could get exposed? You, as an employer, if you're in an at-will state, have the right to terminate somebody if they refuse to come back to work. Now, assuming you as a company are abiding by all the rules and regulations, so if there's a stay-at-home order and you haven't been approved as a life-sustaining or received an exception, then you might get into a little bit of trouble there. But for the most part, if you have been approved, received an exception, or considered life-sustaining, have work in another state maybe that has been cleared to work, if employees are refusing, you as a company won't be liable for those unemployment charges. If an employee would be granted the ability to continue unemployment, if they plead their case strongly enough, and if they get a kind unemployment officer, you never know what will happen. But for you as a company, I wanted you to know that you have options, and don't let them kind of tie your wrists together, if you will, but you can terminate them or proceed with your disciplinary action process that you already have in place. So I also just wanted to touch briefly on paid sick leave and the PPP. Continue to get questions about, if I have somebody who is out and they're taking advantage of the paid sick leave that's available to them or the extended FMLA, do I do that or do I tuck it under my PPP to be able to meet those requirements? So the only thing that I will say to you is that you have to look at your own unique situation. Keep in mind that any payroll tax credit you take related to paid sick leave is not taxable for employer FICA, whereas the wages that you pay that will be covered under a PPP loan, those are taxable. So it might be peanuts and it might be a lot of money. So take that into consideration when you're making a decision as to which way is the best for you. It's not a blanket approach, not cookie cutter, and it could very well differ from one company to the other. So those are the updates that I have for you today. You'll see me again in a little bit. Tom, was there anything that I missed that came to mind with respect to the unemployment or the payroll tax credit?
I don't think so. I have a couple of comments on that, Kristi, but no, I think you've got it covered.
All right. See you soon.
All right. Well, thank you, Kristi. And I won't take a lot of time here on the tax updates either, but not a lot happened this week, but a couple of things that did, I think, have some significance, and I certainly did want to touch on those. I've mentioned in each of the last couple of weeks that this whole process of extending filing deadlines at the federal level has kind of been kind of a slow process. It's kind of been step by step. At first, we only had an extension to make payments. Then it was to file the returns as well. But then it didn't include all of the returns we were looking for. Last week, I was able to report a few more returns. Well, I'm able to report even more this week. IRS Notice 2020-23 was released this past week and then updated all within the same week. And the biggest news in that is the June 15 estimated payments that just seem to be really kind of in a strange place previously, since the second quarter estimates were due before the first quarter estimates. The April 15 payments got moved back to July 15, but they had not acted on the June 15 estimates. Well, Notice 2020-23 takes care of that. In fact, any payments that an individual or corporation owes to the IRS with a due date of April 1 to July 15 are now due July 15. So the second quarter estimates will be due at the same time as the first quarter estimates come July 15th of this year. A couple of other forms of note, there were several, but ones I just wanted to point out that were included in the extension include Form 706, that's the estate tax return. If you're wrapping up a federal estate for someone who passed away within the last year and you have a due date in that time period. I know I have a client I'm working with that had an odd due date of April 26th, I believe it was. We now have to July 15th to file that return. Forms 990 typically due May 15th. For not-for-profit organizations, they're moved back to July 15, as well as we got some relief for United States citizens that are abroad, maybe having trouble getting back to the U.S. and file. They have some relief as well. So when it comes to anything income tax related, pretty much now July 15 is going to be the magic date. Another area that certainly gets much of the media attention are the economic stimulus payments, the direct payments to taxpayers. You've probably heard in the news that those payments did begin last Friday, April 10. The IRS has announced that they would like to have payments out to up to 80 million taxpayers by tomorrow. Personally, I don't know anyone who's received one yet. I don't know if just my area of the country is behind the curve on that or what the situation is there, but we certainly do see in the news. I've seen it on Twitter that people are receiving those payments. So if you are eligible for that payment, be checking your bank account. Hopefully you'll have some money in there, if not already, very soon. A couple of other things in regards to that program. On Friday, the IRS did launch a portal at their website at www.irs.gov to allow those who would typically not file to go on and file a simple 2019 return so that they get into the system and it generates their payment. Now remember, if you've already filed a 2018 and or 2019 return, you don't have to do anything further. If you're a Social Security recipient, you don't have to do anything further. So that probably is a kind of a small segment of the population who may need to take this step. But if you are in doubt, you can go out there and file at that portal. They have also said that by the end of this week, a second portal will be launched to allow you to put your direct deposit information in if it's not already on file with the IRS or you'd like to change it. And it'll be a portal similar to what you may be familiar with in the past. They had a Where's My Refund segment at the website that if you were expecting a tax return refund, you could go out and see what the status of that is. This portal will allow you to check on where your stimulus payment is. So good news there. That seems to be moving along quickly. Another small piece that came out this week that I thought was really significant and somewhat of a surprise to us. As you've heard Chad and Steve talk in past weeks about the PPP loan program and its popularity, then you've also heard me talk about things like the employee retention payroll credit and the ability of employers to defer the employer share of Social Security taxes for 2 years. But you've also heard me say in both of those weeks that you couldn't take advantage of that program if you were also taking a PPP loan. Well, an FAQ did come out this week on the ability to delay the payment of the Social Security taxes and had what I thought was a little bit of a surprise in it. Even if you are utilizing the PPP loan, you may elect to defer the employer piece of the Social Security taxes from the enactment date, which was March 27th, through the date that you're granted forgiveness on your PPP loan. So obviously most of you probably started putting your PPP applications in somewhere around April 9th, April 2nd, which was the launch date. You may still be in that process of having your loan reviewed and approved. So that's a couple of weeks right there until it's funded, 8 weeks out. You may have 3-4 months of time that if you choose, you can delay paying those Social Security taxes and pushing them out to paying 50% of them at 12/31/21 and 50% at 12/31/22. So a little bit of a cash flow boost to you there if you choose to take advantage of that. We also got guidance this past week in the form of actually 2 notices as well as an FAQ on the new net operating loss rules, talking about how to go about applying for the refund if you do have a business loss in 2018, 2019, or 2020. If you did have that loss in 2018, it does require you to take some fairly prompt action. If you're carrying that loss back for up to a 5-year period, you need to get that claim in by June 30th of this year to request that. And there's some, in the guidance that came out, there's some streamlined ways to do that. In fact, beginning on the 17th, later this week, I believe that's Friday, you will be able to fax your claims in. And that's important because one of the other notes here is the IRS has stopped, for the time being, processing paper filed tax returns of any sort. So if you send it in paper, it's going to sit. The IRS has furloughed a number of employees. Some of their service centers are not even open. We've heard reports of mounds of paperwork being mailed to the IRS that are just sitting in trailers waiting to be opened. So I would encourage you, don't send anything via paper to the IRS, even if you're responding to tax notices, other correspondence. Some of that may even be returned to you if that service center is closed. But real good news there on the net operating losses. Great way to generate some cash for you if you are in that situation. Guidance was also released this week on the interest expense deductibility. We had talked about that previously, that if you're a larger entity, that's defined as $26 million or more in revenue for 2019, you do have to go through some computations to determine whether you can deduct all of the interest expense that's on your books currently or carry that forward. The deductibility was expanded, and they gave us some guidance as to how to apply those provisions this week. I also want to make note on another topic that I've talked about a little bit in the past couple of weeks, the provision that you now, if you have been affected either financially or have been infected with the coronavirus, you have the ability to take up to $100,000 out of your retirement plan without penalty, be taxed on that over 3 years. There's also some provisions in there that allow you to take a larger percentage or a larger dollar amount of your retirement monies in the form of a loan, as well as if you're age 72 or older, you can waive taking a required minimum distribution from your retirement plan this year. Well, those are all very beneficial planning tools for you as the individual, but it should be noted for those of you that are employers listening today or sponsoring those plans, in order to allow those things to happen, your plan document does need to be amended. Now, I know most third-party administrators are reaching out to you. They're making that process very easy. Sometimes it's just a check mark and a signature. But if you haven't heard from your third-party administrator and you do want to provide these provisions to your employees, you may want to reach out to them and make sure that your plan is going to allow these provisions. That's just a small tidbit I came across this past week. It's one of those things where we just have to make sure we have the I's dotted and the T's crossed. I want to just wrap up today with just to again remind you that as we roll into our next piece of the presentation here today, cash continues to be king. Getting as much cash into your operations as possible is going to be key to you coming out of this thing. And there's a number of ways to do that using taxes to your advantage. Some of them are these new rules that just came out in the CARES Act. We've already talked about the net operating loss provisions. We've talked in prior weeks about the qualified improvement property provisions, whereas if you've done building renovations over the last couple of years, there may be an opportunity to go back and recapture some of that cost as an immediate deduction rather than depreciating it over 39 years. Anytime we talk about building renovations or building purchases or renovations, we also think of things like cost segregation studies, Section 179D studies, and certainly we don't have time today to go into great detail of what those things mean in tremendous detail, but what it really means is if you've put a building in place, there are tax provisions out there to get you a much, much faster write-off of the cost of that building. So if you've purchased a building, you've built a building, you've done an addition or you've done renovations in 2018 or 2019, you may want to look into these type of tools if you haven't already. They can be done fairly easily. They generate tax deductions. They may in turn generate a net operating loss, which all of that in the form of amended tax returns can lead to cash back from the IRS and state governments. One that's a favorite of mine, my area of the firm is strategic taxes. Our firm does a tremendous amount of research and development tax credit studies. I know a lot of you are on the call. We work with you in that, whether you're in the architecture, engineering, or construction community, whether you're in the manufacturing community, technology, agriculture. I would just say if you're in any of those fields or if you're doing anything innovative at all in your firm and you haven't utilized the R&D tax credit, you may want to take a look at that. We often walk into firms who haven't used it and we immediately do back year studies going back to 2018, 2017. Get that study done, get amended tax returns in place, and get you some refunds of those dollars. And the last area I would talk about is state and local taxes. We often talk about state and local taxes maybe from a little bit more negative light because those states are getting very aggressive to go after revenue from you. And boy, we really expect that's going to be the case when this thing is all over because obviously the state and local governments are just really hemorrhaging cash here as they put all these programs in place. And we expect that they're going to be pretty aggressive, not only in raising taxes potentially, but maybe increasing taxes. Those are all the things we can help you with to mitigate, but there are some things out there that actually with good tax planning, you may be able to shift income or look at being taxed at a lower rate tax state. So I won't get into any of that detail today, but I'd be happy to follow up with any of you who have any questions or thoughts on that because we are really just trying to be, as creative as we can, as proactive as we can, of finding ways to help you finance, the startup as we get back to normal. So I think that's a good lead-in for me to take you to the next step of our presentation today. I'm honored to be able to introduce my partner, Rick Hogentogler. Today, Rick is our Business Development Director. Rick's new, obviously, here to the Town Hall, but Rick's been extremely involved here in the firm in what we call our Future View, our anticipatory organization concept and initiative that we've been taking on for quite a while. And Rick's going to set the stage and tell you about that. So, Rick.
Hey, thanks, Tom. And again, appreciate the opportunity here to share some of the things that Stambaugh Ness has been doing. We really see this right now, a period of time, as a time to pivot. Since our SN Town Hall meetings that, as Tom said, started back on March 20th, almost a month, I'd say we've been in a proactive mode, in an effort to address the new regulations, which you heard from our panelists were changing by the hour. Interpreting the guidance, preparing applications for the various programs. And we saw our town hall meetings as a means to try to take on and respond to those needs. But as I said, now is a time to pivot. And rather than being in a proactive mode, which is agile, nimble, reacting to recently issued regulations, we want you to start to think about moving to a pre-active mode. Now, I'm going to pause for a second because one of my associates, Kristi Weierbach, who has been on this panel since day one, when we start talking about that inside the firm, and it's a concept that we follow, she said, Rick, there's no such word as pre-active. And I tend to agree with her. If you go out in the dictionary, you're not going to see that. But when we define pre-active, we put that in the context of forward thinking, future view, anticipatory. Let me give you some context as to how Stambaugh Ness has approached this, and give you some examples of how we've gone into this concept of being an anticipatory or future view. It was almost 2 years ago when our president, Steve Hake, gave an assignment to a number of our practice leaders and service leaders to read a book entitled The Anticipatory Organization, authored by a well-known futurist, speaker and presenter, a gentleman by the name of Daniel Burrus. It's been over that time, and as I said, 2 years where we went through the program, studied it, did workshops, and actually since that time on a weekly basis, meet collaboratively as a team. We refer to it as our AO, Anticipatory War Room, where we're looking at issues, trends that we know are going to happen, and then try to identify solutions and remedies to deal with those trends, to be kind of a disruptor rather than being disrupted. The outcome of this ongoing effort has developed a team of critical thinkers. Many of them you've been exposed to in our panel that have been presenting over the last couple of weeks. You're going to be meeting some additional ones. But it has allowed us to focus on developing future-ready solutions, not just for Stambaugh Ness, but for our clients. I mentioned earlier that it was our president, Steve Hake, that brought this, and quite honestly, Steve is a real visionary and has led us down this path. So I like to refer to him as our Chief Transformational Officer rather than just a president. But what we've learned, through this process is acting on certainties instead of things that are unknown, which allows us to then make decisions, take actions, and move forward with a sense of, higher success and less failure rates. As we all have heard, and we even heard Tom mention it, that the pandemic is going to end, and we're starting to hear some encouraging data results, testing, immunizations. But the question is it possible to make the new post-pandemic normal better than what we had before? I mentioned Daniel Burrus's book, The Anticipatory Organization, and in that book, he covers a key principle. And those of you that are maybe possibly students of Burrus and some of my associates, it's a key principle of take your biggest problem and skip it. In a recent article that Burris wrote, he shared with us, it was titled, "And in certain times, you have more control than you realize." And he states, and I want to quote him here, he says, "The real problem in your business isn't the virus. It's how you're reacting to it." He goes on to say, "Don't panic. Focus on defining the real problem both you and your customers are having, and use the certainties found to reveal the solutions." End of quote. Today, what we have to do today will define, the future and the future view of our firms and everybody's firm. So I think a key takeaway is when you hear some of the conversations on television and even within your groups, within your firm, you'll hear people saying, "We can't do this. We're not sure what we're going to do." What we want to encourage you to focus on, to be anticipatory, to be proactive, is put aside those things that you can't do, and let's focus on those things that you can do, And that's why we've developed this concept of the 30, 60, 90 days, where we hope to be able to share with you some of our other associates speaking on some key functional areas that you may want to be addressing as you look into this re-entry out of this pandemic, and how will your business be the new norm as it relates to changes at your place. So at this time, I'm going to ask Kristi she's going to be bringing in some of the other panelists, and we've identified a number of areas that we've reflected on, identified things that, talking about the what's, what can you be doing in this 30 days. So Kristi, take over.
All right, well, thank you, and don't you go anywhere. So if the rest of my colleagues would show your beautiful faces, that would be fantastic. And as they're appearing here on the screen in front of you, I just wanted to share a little bit with how we're going to handle this roundtable discussion. So as Rick mentioned, we're going to talk about, okay, what can we do specifically as we think about bringing our operations back up and running, thinking about how do we balance and manage our cash flow through these next couple months. What do we need to be thinking about from a client or a supplier standpoint? And then also, as we bring our employees back to work, what are the things that we need to be thinking about? So I'm going to be moderating and asking questions of my colleagues, to which they'll respond. Initially out of the gate, I'll tag one person, but then everybody's invited after their response to be able to chime in and maybe add additional insight and thoughts. So the one new member of the team up here you'll see is Darren Welker. Darren, do you want to wave for us? He is going to be bringing that operational and facility lens to the conversation. You all have met Katie before, you've met Steve Snyder. And so then Rick is going to be coming from a perspective of the client and suppliers. So, Katie, I'm going to pick on you first, if that's okay. Katie, as you think about bringing employees back to work and you think about this future, what advice do you have for companies as to what they should be thinking about that they can do now while they're planning in the next couple weeks to bring them back? You're on mute, Katie. You're pulling a Steve Snyder.
All right, Steve, so I took it for you this time. You can join the club, Steve, if you want today. So a couple things come to mind when we think about the first 30 days, the reentry point. And before I jump into that, I think this is such a great opportunity for companies to be extraordinary. You're hearing a lot of different companies out there who are doing some amazing things. And I think even just with the culture in itself, you can be extraordinary. Part of the key ingredient for that is communication. And really helping people understand your plan. What's the plan going forward? Why are we doing those things? So the opportunity to be extraordinary is controlling the narrative, and you do that by stopping rumors and gossip before it starts. Anytime that there's rumors or gossip of any sort, it breeds uncertainty and it could damage your culture. So it's important to see, understand what's going on, things that are being said. Anoint a person who is going to be your partner in communication. Maybe that's not an area of strength for you. So determine who is the key person for that, and maybe it might be several. The other thing with communication is creating a time frame. What is your reentry goal? Kristi and I were talking earlier today, and we were kind of talking about, well, what do you think? You know, what's your idea on what this looks like? And we kind of picked the same date. And I don't know, Kristi, if we should even be as bold as sharing that today, but it was something where we were thinking, could it be mid-May? And whatever you feel like your reentry point would be, communicate that. And then back it up with, here's why we think that. Know that there will be a time where you may have to go and say, well, we thought it was going to be mid-May, and given the circumstances around us, we've decided it's going to be something different. But again, getting in front of that communication. I think another key ingredient is a culture spot check, of really understanding, what's going on now with our culture. So we talked about communication a little bit. This is a great opportunity, again, to be extraordinary, thinking about what are some things that we could probably change in our culture. What are some things that we're learning about ourselves now that we are remote? Are there some people that their position, it could be remote after all? And what are the changes that we need to take place? So these kind of conversations can happen now as you plan for your reentry. The other thing is you might want to consider surveying your employees. Ask them how are they doing with being remote, what they like, what they don't like. This might give you a little bit of a barometer on your retention rate and really kind of determine, we've got some big problems. It doesn't look like a handful of these folks are coming back. So now you're starting to think about hiring. And how many people do you think that you might need to hire as a result of some of the people that might not want to come back to work, like what Kristi was talking about earlier today? And then maybe kind of figuring out who you would bring back. That's a big question that I think a lot of you are probably thinking about today. And, making sure that you're partnering with some of the folks that are representing their specialties today, operations, facilities, and making sure that the person, whether it's HR or point person who's making personnel decisions, that they're sitting in with those operation folks and facility folks so they can hear some of the discussions that are happening. This is your time to really maximize the strengths that you do have within your organization and pull on those expertise and rise above this and become stronger even more than before. The other option that I would say is really kind of thinking about the facilities, and Darren, I might be tiptoeing into your area, but thinking about, is our facility clean enough? Are we ready to go to market where we have our employees coming back? Do we have enough protective gear for everybody? I got to tell you, there's times where we go to the grocery store and the people who are going into the grocery store are the ones who have the gloves and the masks, but the employees do not. So it kind of makes you a little concerned. And then also, too, your EAP program, it's really, a lot of these companies are putting out great material, making sure that you're up to date on those as well. They may even want to come in. You may want to have a special counseling session for your folks so that they know that they have somebody that they can go to. Now I'll take it back to Kristi.
Thank you, Katie. Does anybody have any other suggestions? Getting an echo. Okay, I think that's better. Thank you. Does anybody have any thoughts or insights that came to mind as Katie was talking? I know, Darren, you have some suggestions from a facility perspective. So do you want to start? Do you have any thoughts that you want to tee off of what Katie said? You're on mute too.
Yeah, okay, we're here.
There you go.
Got me right. All right, good. Thank you. And yeah, I think we'll probably hear a lot of overlap in some of the panelists' comments today, because all these things are very closely interrelated, especially from an operational standpoint. To be perfectly honest, a lot of the things that I was coming up with as talking points, I was thinking, probably will end up being covered by other panelists. But yeah, I mean, I think, sorry, I like to talk with my hands, so hopefully that doesn't distract anybody.
That's okay.
My feeling from an operational standpoint is that, it's very much a situation of there's no one size fits all solution here, because we see such a broad range of impact, and it's, it can be dependent on your physical location. It can be dependent on, obviously, the industry that you operate in. So clearly we know that some of the industries like restaurants, hospitality, entertainment, it's been a pretty profound impact on some of those industries. Maybe on the other end of the spectrum, you have professional service firms that are more naturally able to operate in a remote environment. And so, the impact to them is maybe not quite as direct, but still probably some impact based depending on activity levels of their customers. So, one thing I was looking at earlier today was, the construction industry, and I found a map of the United States, and there's actually very few states, only 4 states in the country that have designated construction as a non-essential activity. So what that tells me is that for a vast majority of the country, construction is still in play in terms of activities. But there are surveys out there that are saying that, as much as 30% of projects right now are either delayed or suspended at the moment. And then, I've also seen surveys in the manufacturing industry that are saying that, again, there's a pretty wide range of activity, but it's maybe not as scary as we think it is. There's, the one survey I read, 50% of the respondents said that they're at full capacity right now, and another 40% said they're at least at partial capacity. So I say all this just to emphasize the fact that, again, depending on what industry you work in or maybe physically where you're located, it could be a pretty wide range of rebound that's required. And so there's not necessarily any one answer, but some of the common denominator of what we're seeing across the board, a lot of companies are starting to kind of need to reassess their capabilities and take a look at what can they be doing, either to replace lost revenue or supplement revenue. And it's been really actually kind of neat to see more and more stories come out about companies that are responding and kind of either reinventing themselves or at least pivoting in the short term to assess the decline in demand for other, maybe their primary project or products and services. So that's been one interesting outcome of all of this so far. Another one that we're seeing, and Katie, this definitely touches, I think, pretty heavily actually on your topic, is related to preparing the workplace. And I'm really kind of equating that to also preparing the workforce along the lines of some of the things, the comments that Katie was making. But this really relates to whether you're talking about a physical location or a job site. No matter what it is, there are certain things that you can be doing, because we've heard it multiple times already. Employees are nervous, and they're, in a lot of cases, just expressing anxiety about coming back to work. And so I think we need to think about and talk about what can the employer be doing to give them confidence. And that can be any number of things, which I think we'll get into in a little more detail later. But basically the whole idea of just taking some steps and precautions to make sure people are comfortable with coming back to work when that decision is made. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on, as far as like high level 30-day topic relates to, I'll call this my measure twice and cut once rule. And that is because it relates to planning and scheduling. Like, you really need to take a hard look at where you left off. And again, we're going to see some interplay with, I think, some comments that Rick's going to make here. You need to kind of assess if you had projects suspended, where you left off, how you're going to restart them. If you're, say, a manufacturing entity, what's the demand for your product and or services? Really kind of assessing what your customer needs are, and then managing your capacity with that demand, and taking a look at, you know, your labor force, what you need, how much you need to bring back at what times, evaluating your material and inventory statuses, and then just scheduling all that out again, because you're potentially starting from scratch if you're restarting from ground zero. But even if you're not, you're needing to now start to figure out how to work things back into your existing capacity. So those are some of my initial comments.
Thank you, Darren. So Rick, that actually does tie in nicely to your area, if you will. And so I'm going to hand it over to you. I want you to show proactive, since you put me out there. Be proactive and let us know, you know, as we're preparing to bring employees back, and we might want to have hand sanitizer, and we want to have, you know, Clorox wipes and so forth. And I know that's not the core of our business, but it's one thing for us to feel safe coming back to work. But what else do we need to be thinking about from a vendor perspective and planning as we start operations again?
Sure, thanks, Kristi. But before I go over to that, I shared with Darren today, I received an email from a commercial cleaning service talking about, you know, what's the condition of your place? What's it look like? Is it where you want it to be? And that's why you want to be thinking about this stuff now. These are things you want to be thinking about, because those needs are going to be there. The supply, how many people are going to have the availability? So to the extent you want to create that, eliminate that anxiety of returning to the workplace, be thinking about these things. I think the other thing that was just amazing, this was on over the noon hour, there's a firm, I'm not quite sure, it's based here in the United States, that has been building for the last, I think, 10 years, robots that the healthcare industry can send this robot into hospital rooms, offices, that type of thing, and it activates itself, sets off the UV rays that will, you know, eliminate a lot of the bacteria. So, you know, there's technology, things are just continuing to change at a rapid pace. But as it relates to our customers and our contracts, I think there are a number of whats that we should be thinking about. And, you know, I bring it back to the conversation that I referred earlier when I was talking about the anticipatory organization, about our AO team and our war room meetings. And when this all hit, there was a message. Again, I'm kind of a disciple of Burris. You can probably tell that I follow him and really believe in the messaging in this future ready and future view concept. But he said, folks, right now, when you're talking about customers, you know, your lifeblood, who you're going to be dealing with, you're going to have to start thinking about that reentry, you know, that integrity, that value, that trust. And to the extent that, you know, you've been shut down for a couple of weeks, or those that have even continued to be still having business, you really need to think about that. And as a firm, and I encourage you to also think about this, that this is a period of focusing on significance versus success. And when you think about that, success, that always kind of is an eye-centric, you know, the top line, we grew the top line, the bottom line, the gross profit, it's results. Whereas at the end of the day, significance is how are your customers going to look to you as a provider, a service, a vendor? Were you there to help them out? Were you there to encourage them in these tough times and play a role in the reentry? So what can you do for your customers? What can you do for those people that have contracts? Well, certainly I think you should be reaching out and checking in and seeing how are they doing. I think the other thing you want to be doing is, as Darren said, to the extent that you were kind of in limbo contracts or jobs or orders that were in place that kind of just went dark or something, find out where they are. Find out, when they feel they're going to be getting back, because that comes back to Katie's comment. You're going to want to know these things so that you can start to staff up and bring the people back. The last thing you want to be doing is bring everybody back and not know what's coming in the pipeline. You think about, well, how do I go about this? And I know many times, even within Stambaugh Ness, we kind of use the 80-20 rule. Look at, where those revenues come, start with that, work down, but make sure that you have a strategic account management team, focusing on those key customers. But I do think that as it relates to, your customers, it's important that we understand where they are, when they think they're going to get back. And the only way you can do that is reaching out, connecting with them, and gaining that insight. But that then folds right into your supply chain, and Darren mentioned that as well. Well, why is this important? Well, we need to be reaching out to those people that are going to be providing the goods and services. What condition are they in? Are they going to be able to, gear up and be able to respond? And unfortunately, if they're not, you need some runway or lead time to start look for alternative sources. So in these 30 days, you want to find out what's coming in the pipeline through your orders, kind of reaffirm those, re-engage those so you get a sense of volume. But then at the same time, make sure you know that those raw materials, that supply chain is going to be there. And quite frankly, I've been in conversations over the last 2 weeks. Darren, you mentioned about construction. And I think because of the uncertainty, there have been projects that maybe have been delayed or just in a hold pattern. But I'm hearing conversation now is if you do have a construction plan that you were planning to launch, you may want to really start talking to the contractors and find out, hey, maybe I can be geared up and prepared to re-enter and, move this project up sooner. And that can create a really great relationship between, you and your vendor, your supplier, your contractor in those cases. So think about not what we can't do, but what can we do in these buckets so that, number one, we're demonstrating significance. In the end, that will help with everybody's success, because everybody on this call, a lot of really smart people, a lot of really good business people, but I think it's a time, make sure you don't squander this opportunity that we have right now in order to identify these what's and act on them, prioritize them, and then continue with them. Kristi?
All right. Does anybody have any thoughts or insights that you want to share based on what Rick had said? Okay. Steve, you're next. So Steve, the next 30 days is critical. Check 1, 2.
Is there still time for me?
Well, I've got a question for you. So as we think about the 30 days and we think about bringing employees back to work and we think about having to follow through on our commitments to the bank for the PPP loan that we took out, and with the end goal, of trying to get 100% forgiveness, what do we need to be doing right now to balance all of that? Because I have received quite a few questions relating to that.
Yeah, that question's coming up more and more often now as people are starting to get past building up the loan calculations, getting their applications in. Now most people are sitting and waiting for the funds to come out and sign their loan agreements. The good news is that this is happening. There's companies that have received funds already, so that's nice. But then when you get them, the next phase of this is determining what do I do with these funds. I have a business that is not allowed to start working in Pennsylvania, right? Construction companies can't be on site right now in most cases. So what do you do with these funds? I want to maximize the forgiveness along with trying to continue to think about the future of the company. What do we need to do? How do we need to position ourselves? Well, you got one of your best resources, your assets, sitting here at home, just waiting to get ready. And now you have the money the funds to put them back on payroll if you had taken them off. The thought here is let's get them working, maybe not in their normal day-to-day job that they're used to doing, but what can we do as a company to position ourselves to come out of this crisis in better shape? One of the things that I'm suggesting is you have your people back on payroll, start holding meetings, calls with management, some key employees, have some conference calls to talk about, brainstorm on what are the potential issues that you're going to run into before you get back to full capacity. Start thinking about those types of things. What do we need to do? How do we need to get ready? You have plenty of people now back on the payroll. What type of training? And again, training comes down to cost. So you have to be able to manage the cost side of this too. But what kind of training and development can you put out there for these employees? For instance, on a construction company or any project-based company, you have a project manager. Well, I think we all know that through time you promote your managers up into these positions, and they never really truly learn how to be the greatest project manager. This is a great opportunity to put them through some training. There's a lot of virtual training. We do a program as well where we help project managers to hone their skills. A good project manager totally drives profit and margin. Other skills, and it doesn't have to be necessarily project managers. It can be anybody within the office setting, anybody that you've been wanting to help them develop their skills, whether it's simple stuff like Excel or other softwares. There's other courses they can be taking to enhance their skills. Work on the business, right? Take the opportunity to revisit current policies, procedures, enhancements. These are all these things you can be doing in that 8-week period, in those first 30 days to drive the business to be successful when you get back in. Anybody that has a lot of contracts, anybody that's knowledgeable can be in reviewing. If you have any projects and you're at risk of losing those, look for the clauses in there, the force majeure and any other types of clauses that will have to deal with terminating the contract. Review your 12-month billing projections, cost projections, all of that stuff to prepare yourself for the upcoming potential day when we can get back to work, which, as Katie said, was going to be May 15th. I wrote that down. I'm holding her to it. We'll see if that really happens. But just thinking about those types of things. And now that you got this money from the PPP, take advantage of bringing back the employees and utilizing them to help come up with ideas for those next 30 days. Now, I wasn't on mute that whole time, was I? I was really hoping I was.
No, you're good. So extending what Steve had shared, that's great. Free resources, if you belong to an association related to your industry, or if you have individuals that are plugged into other type of communities and so forth, see what free resources are available to you. I think about your insurance broker, health insurance broker. They might have a lot of great resources at your fingertips. So, explore that too, because you are worried about cash flow and worried about how do we balance it all? We don't want to spend a lot right now, but that would be one thing to think about. So was it Darren or Rick that was starting to speak? I'm sorry.
That was me, Kristi. That was Darren.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
So yeah, I just wanted to maybe tag along there with Steve, because I think we're all kind of in that mode right now of trying to figure out what can we be doing to spend this time productively. And so just some things that come to my mind when I'm thinking about that, first and foremost maybe is, any company should be thinking in terms of what have been their most significant challenges. And now's the perfect time to be addressing those, at least attempting to think about some solutions for them. But some things that I've observed over the years with clients, relate to ERP systems, for example, where, a company might have an ERP system and only frankly using a fraction of the functionality of it. And so what else can you be doing in this downtime to improve your utilization of the resources you already have? In addition to that, what other processes can you be developing during this time? And I'm thinking about things like, I know a lot of companies have pricing and estimating models that they've had in place for probably 30 years. And is now a good time to assess those and decide, do they still make sense, or is there maybe another model that we need to think about implementing? So, those are all, scheduling is another one. I know that's kind of a challenge for a lot of companies. And, in addition to, I think the project management idea that Steve threw out there is a great one also.
All right, thank you. So one thing you might need to look at in the next 30 days is your strategy. The strategy that you had used in the past may not be relevant as you look forward, because your customers and suppliers and so forth have definitely been impacted as well. So does anybody have a comment about looking at strategy going forward and strategic planning? Rick, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just say that, the key thing is to take this time to look over these areas, and maybe as a firm or as a business, you have other areas. We've identified 4 categories here, and I just think it's critically important that people reflect, assess, and identify what can we be doing. I think that is just so important. And then when you've identified that, because like I say, you got a lot of smart people, list out what you can be doing, prioritize them, put due dates, deadlines. We're going to get this done this week, next week, so that at the end of the 30 days, you're going to be able to look back and say, here's what we identified, here's what we've implemented, here's what we've accomplished, and then keep moving. Because we're going to come out of this, folks. And the whole game is, let's come out under a new norm based on your individual circumstances. But please take this time, don't squander it, because there are opportunities across the board. You and your organizations know them best, but you got to take the time and reflect, on those areas.
It was interesting, in one of our internal conversations, I had said, well, think about the manufacturing companies who had to refit their operations to be able to make hand sanitizer, right? Some of the big, like GM, Ford, and so forth. And I made a comment, well, they're going to have to plan to now revert back. And Darren, I think it might have been you that said, well, maybe they'll continue to just produce that type of product, or even new product that they never did in the past. So Darren, anything that you want to add about that, teeing off of Rick's comment about opportunity?
I would just maybe refer back to my earlier comments about, a lot of companies are responding in a way to kind of ensure the longevity of the business. And by that, I guess I mean that, they recognize that the demand for their traditional products may have declined, and they're filling a new market need. And that need, if quite frankly, as it relates to hand sanitizer, that might be a long-term demand now. So that might be something that some of these companies that are retooling a little bit to satisfy that demand, that might be a long-term product option now. So, I mean, I think at some point we are going to get to a point where some companies will need to make choices about, whether they have identified new markets or if they're going to revert back to some of the traditional markets that they've worked in.
Yeah.
Kristi, I would say, But just to tag on to Darren, we've had these conversations in the AO team. I think you're going to see a huge shift in U.S. manufacturing because we got a wake-up call here of U.S. dependency on imports, particularly in the pharmaceutical and medical areas. So I think we got to be thinking about that and what opportunities are there, whether you've retooled or looking to that. So I think there's going to be a heavy push. I know you've talked to some AE firms that are heavy into the working with the medical fields. This area you got to really look at because I said I think there will be opportunities, but you're going to have to sit down and identify them, prioritize them. That's probably going to be out in your 60 and 90 days. The things we talked about are things you got to be getting on now. As Steve Snyder said, you're going to have resources. You're able to pay the people, get those people that are in your administrative management team, calling those customers, get those salespeople out there, connecting with them and reconnecting them, and getting that data to feed back to production and manufacturing or operations. So don't just sit on your hands. Keep looking towards what's coming out of this because it's going to come quick. It's going to come quick. I mean, I know you said May 15th, Katie, but that'll happen quickly, even though it seems like the last 4 weeks a little long. Thank you.
So Steve Snyder, when you think about those companies that rely heavily on government funding, whether at the federal or state level, it could be construction projects, transportation, could be nonprofits. What tips or suggestions do you have for those companies?
Yeah, so the funding side of any project, right? I think we're going to see a major shift in the way we look at things and the funding. And I think the one of the easiest ways to understand why there might be a shift in the federal and state funding is simply the CARES Act package. What was it, 2.2 trillion? That's huge. Where's that money coming from? So they're going to have to move some funds around. And if you're highly dependent upon federal state funding, you should be looking at your business model and looking for other resources for funding. And again, I'm thinking of potential not-for-profits and such. That's easy for me to say. I do know that, in that world, it's an growing battle for finding funding sources. And I'm pretty sure everybody's aware that you're always trying to diversify those resources. But I think you're going to see those sources take a hit here in the future. So looking at ways to diversify your services from their funding perspective, how you're going to, from the construction side, if you're doing a lot of federally funded work, state funded work, there's a potential for some of that to slow down as well. Again, diversification. That's the best way to handle any kind of risk you run from concentration. For any services or that type of business model where you're looking at concentrations of funding, start thinking about different pricing models. The problem isn't necessarily the funding. The problem could be your pricing model, how you're going about things. Try to skip that, Rick used that term earlier. Said skip that problem. Take your biggest problem, just skip it. Try to think about different ways to diversify and grow widen your practice. And you're looking at your customer base as well. What can you do here? Maybe for so long you were very comfortable in a certain customer base. Maybe it's time to spread that out a little bit too. Look for those opportunities. And again, this all boils down to the type of industry you're in. And bringing back people earlier is a great way to start brainstorming now as to what those opportunities could be.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We're soon going to shift over to our Q&A to take some of the questions that our attendees have for us. I know we've been doing a pretty good job of answering those as we've been talking throughout the past hour or so. Any parting words from any of my roundtable guests here as we shift over to Q&A? Katie, do you have anything for the leadership that's on this call and listening?
Sure. I know that I've said a few of these things earlier, but I think it really holds fast now. There's 4 key things for leaders to really consider, regardless the size of your organization. The first one is trust. Always speak the truth and explain what's happening and how you're getting to the decisions that you're getting to. The second one is stability, to be able to absorb the emotional reactions to help people feel calm in these situations. Compassion, you don't have to be high in empathy to have compassion. At the end of the day, we're looking to acknowledge the negative emotional impact so that we can really truly seek to understand before being understood. And then hope, to elevate how this all will help the organization in the future. You've heard multiple times us saying we're going to be better once we get to the other side. That's how you deliver hope.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to ask Tom to join us here. Can you turn on your camera? And you're going to take us through to the end with the help of Kaylee with the question and answers.
Thank you, Kristi, and thank you to all the panel. Great job with that. A lot of great advice for everyone, and we look forward to next week taking the next step into the 60-day look at that. So, yeah, we're going to ask Kaylee to come back here and start giving us some of the questions. So maybe Chad can come back on the screen as well. And I believe Phil Keeney is out there somewhere also in case we have any IT questions. So Kaylee, what do you have?
Kaylee, you're on mute.
I knew I pulled a Snyder there. All righty. The first one is for you, Tom. It says, employer with greater than 100 employees. If business is not directed by government to shut down, but client sites where employees perform the work are, and these employees are paid for COVID non-worked hours, do they qualify for the retention tax credit for those payments, even if later laid off?
Yeah, if I'm understanding that question correctly, unfortunately, I think the answer to that is probably no. Under the employee retention credit, if you do have more than 100 employees, the credit is only available for the time that you are closed as a result of the virus or the economic conditions. Now, I guess I'll amend that answer a little bit. It's closed because of an economic shutdown, or you also can qualify if you've taken a significant revenue hit, meaning that your revenue for the current quarter is 50% or less than it was the previous quarter, or not the previous quarter, but the same quarter a year ago. And you can keep taking the credit until that goes back above 80% or till we get to December 31st of 2020. I'd also remind you that if you are taking the PPP loan, you would not be allowed to take the employer retention credit.
Alrighty, and I have 2 more for you, and this is just a reminder for anybody that has any questions pertaining to any of the subjects on the left-hand side of the screen. Now would be the time to enter them. So Tom, how does a company take advantage of the payroll tax deferral?
The Form 941, the quarterly payroll tax returns, are being modified for the second quarter forward. So my understanding is you will just make an election on that form to not remit the employer's Social Security tax. Obviously, you can also factor that into the Form 941 deposits that you make when you make your periodic payroll payments. Again, remembering if you are doing the PPP loan, you have the Social Security deferral available to you from March 27 through the date of your forgiveness. And I know saying that probably raises the next question. March 27th, if we happen to have a payroll there in those last few days in March, would actually fall on my first quarter Form 941, not on the second quarter. we're still waiting to a little bit clearer guidance on that. But my guess is if you've already remitted those dollars, you may be able to reconcile that and amend that when the second quarter 941 is issued. Kristi, have you heard anything more on that?
No, I haven't seen the updated 941 form yet. I'm anxiously awaiting to see how they do that. I just checked it today. But yeah, you're right. It'll be reconciled on Q2. We just got to wait and see. I imagine probably in May sometime we'll see that.
Alrighty, and the next one is for you, Kristi. It says, if and when the government opens up the country, but requires gloves and masks in public, is that something that employers will have to supply to the employee daily?
Oh, that's a really good question. I guess depending on social distancing and the type of work that the individual conducts, are they suspect to getting close contact with clients and customers and so forth? I'm not quite sure. Hopefully we'll get more guidance on that. One of the things that Governor Wolf had said yesterday was that we need to have a readily available supply of PPE, sorry, for not only those in the medical profession, but also for, the rest of the communities and so forth. So good question. I don't know firmly what the answer is, but hopefully we get that clarity.
All right, and another one for you, Kristi, and this might be one that you might want to take offline, so I apologize. It's a question on the FFCRA and calculations. It says, could you assist us in coming up with the correct calculation? For example, we have an employee who has a standard work week of 42 hours, but occasionally works more. Should we be doing the 6-month average for this employee?
It depends on the situation, if the employee is full-time or part-time and so forth. And yes, we are in the process of firming up a spreadsheet to be able to help with those calculations. So I think that's better suited for offline.
All righty, perfect. And the next one is for Steve. How about impact on FAR overhead in relation to bringing people back on overhead?
Well, there's no change in the rules for your FAR overhead audit as of today. So you would bring them back, and of course, if you don't have any projects going on, you wouldn't have any direct labor, so that would all go to indirect labor. And then as long as that those wages fall under, the appropriate sections of the FAR for being allowable, then it should qualify. And now I'm saying all this absent any potential clarification that will come out in the future. But as it stands now, an employee that you're paying, and again, like I was saying earlier in the panel, if you're paying your employees, if you're bringing them back, you really should be trying to maximize what you're getting out of the employees. So for your direct labor type employee, you should be trying to help leverage their knowledge and their experience to improve processes, potentially putting your project managers through project management training. All of these items are going to help drive profit in the future. It's investment time, and that training is allowable expense for the FAR.
All righty, and the next one is a PPP forgiveness question. So either Chad or Steve, are the wage reduction calculations made on a total payroll basis, or do they have to be done on an employee by employee basis?
I'm not sure I understand that one, Chad.
I think they're asking, do you take the total pot of wages divided by the FTEs to get your wages per employee, which I don't think is correct. I think it's going to actually be, they're going to look at each individual employee's compensation to aggregate your disallowance. So you don't push everybody together and then take the average. You look at each individual and their threshold and amount over 100,000.
Alrighty, and this one is another one for Steve. Can you use the PPP loan to pay rent expense in advance for multiple months?
So that's a tricky way. Sounds like a loophole, right? The language that is written in the bill says incurred and paid, or payment made, something to those long. But incurred would be actually relates to that time period, and then paid would be that you paid it as well. So it's your accrual and your cash basis. I would think it doesn't make a lot of sense for them to allow you to prepay rent for so many months, even though it's an eligible expense. But with that said, as you calculate out your forgiveness, rent does not fall into the forgiveness calculation, but it is an eligible expense. And you do not need to spend all of the money within 8 weeks. So you still have that 2-year loan period where you can still spend that cash on rent. If that makes sense. I hope it does. I hope I said it right.
Steve, to that point, I think you said the rent is not included in the forgiveness. I think you may have misspoken there. I think it is included in the forgiveness, but you have to be careful of that 75% rule.
Yes, the payroll costs are the 75% rule. The other 25% are eligible costs to be spent on rent, retirement, all of that. But that does not have to be spent in those 8 weeks. And then you still have your exemption potentially that comes in if you bring back your full workforce by June 30th. Clarification to be coming on that in the near future, we hope. That's still very vague area.
And that 75%, just if I can jump in, that's a question I've seen a couple of different times. The 75% payroll, 25% non-payroll, my understanding is that's measured during the 8-week period, and that's the split of the loan forgiveness. Not more than 25% of the loan forgiveness may be attributable to non-payroll costs. So I'm reading that right out of the interim final rules that they're measuring that based on the loan forgiveness period, not the full loan period. Because once you're out of that forgiveness period, those funds are just a 1% loan. So that's my take on that. And Steve, Tom, if you guys see it differently, but that's my interpretation.
Yep, I agree.
Alrighty, and Tom, this next one's for you. Is there a time frame on individuals who do not have direct deposit for taxes on receiving a check?
It's potentially fairly lengthy. After they go through this round of making payments via direct deposit, they will start a mail process, but we don't have an exact deadline on that, but we've heard that could take several months, as much as 3 or 4 months for the checks to be mailed out. So if you have a bank account, some place for that money to go, we would strongly encourage, when the portal opens up later this week, to go on there and enter that data to kind of expedite your monies.
Okay, and another one for you, Tom, related to that stimulus money. Can you verify that the stimulus money will not need to be paid back when you do the reconciliation of the 2020 tax return? On the flip side, would you receive additional credit if you would be owed more?
Yes and yes. Good news both sides there. They've already stated that if you receive the dollars based on either your 2018 or your 2019 return, and when you ultimately file your 2020 return, your income would have otherwise been over the limits, they will not make you pay monies back that you already received. In fact, we've been seeing some clients be kind of strategic on that. If they met the criteria in 2018, but are not going to meet it in 2019, in many cases, they're holding off filing their 2019 return, since they now have till July 15 to generate that payment. So that has been stated. I think that is in the FAQ that came out from the IRS, that they will not make you pay back any monies that you otherwise would not have received. On the flip side, if your income does decrease in 2020 to the effect that you are deserving of a payment but didn't get it based on 2018 or 2019, that will be reconciled with your 2020 tax return, and you will get either, if you didn't receive anything previously, all of that money, or the difference. One good example in that, one that we've read a lot about, would be for folks who may be having children here in 2020. Obviously, based on the 2018 and 2019 return, they wouldn't get that additional $500 for the newborns, but when they reconcile the returns at year end, they should get those additional monies.
Alrighty, thank you, Tom. This next one's going to be for Kristi. If in the past we haven't allowed remote working, but now once the businesses start to open up, personnel wants to work remotely because they would prefer, how should we deal with this? We probably can't force them to come back, so how do we deal with people to stop working remotely and come back into the office?
Yeah, good question. I think a lot of people are going to be interested in working from home. So what I would suggest is letting employees know that this was temporary due to the COVID-19. And as a management team, sit back and say, okay, where does it make sense? Are there opportunities for us to save money, possibly by allowing employees to work from home? You don't need as much physical space, possibly. So if you have a rental agreement that's coming due, maybe you explore that and renegotiate or think differently about that. So yeah, I expect some employees are going to probably demand it, request it, but I would lean back on it being temporary and then decide whether or not it makes good business sense for you to have a remote workforce. For us, it does. We have over 60% of our team that works remotely, but for other industries, it's not as feasible. So it's not a one-size-fits-all, unfortunately, but if you want to talk a little bit further, I'd be happy to continue that conversation about your specific organization. Does Katie or
Kristi,
Phil
this is
have
Darren.
anything that you want to share? Oh, go ahead.
Can I just add a comment?
Sure.
I'll be the invisible voice here.
Okay.
One thing I didn't mention in the panel discussion was just in case people aren't aware, was a document that I came across on the Department of Labor website. There's a link to an OSHA document that talks about guidance on preparing the workplace for COVID-19. And it's actually a pretty good document that explains like some of the steps you should take from a hygiene standpoint, potentially reconfiguring office space or production space, and then goes on to talk about workplace controls that you can put in place, such as air filtration and increased ventilation systems. So just in case people aren't aware of that, it might be something to take a look at.
Yeah, thank you, Darren. Katie or Phil, did you have anything to extend on what I shared about remote workforce?
We give Phil an opportunity to talk.
Get myself off of mute first. Didn't want to be a statistic there like Steve. But no, it's, I think I would urge companies to think outside the box when they're evaluating coming back, bringing staff back. I had a bunch of notes here, and the surveys are out regarding businesses' adoption to a remote workforce. I get it. There's some companies out there that it doesn't make sense for. But I can guarantee you there's companies that you may sit back and say, hey, this remote workforce thing, it doesn't make sense to me. I would maybe beg to differ and say you probably have a good handful of employees that could be left working from home or working remote. And just like Darren had alluded to there's going to be expenses either when you cut it or bringing staff back to the office from a PPE perspective. And my prediction, if you choose not to adopt this remote workforce methodology, is you're going to struggle to retain talent. It's just, people across the board are liking that flexibility. So I would just urge you to just evaluate, how you're going to manage, not if you're going to bring employees back, but okay, if we're going to leave them home, how do we go about managing them? And I've actually had several large conferences out there that maybe I was supposed to attend, or other organizations, other individuals may have been up for attending. Well, instead of completely canceling those conferences, they actually thought outside the box and said, hey, you know what, we're going to reduce the price and actually, a fraction of the total cost And we're going to do these meetings virtual with the communication platforms that they have. And the outcome has been fantastic. I don't have to get up and leave my home. I don't have to jump on a plane, although some people may desire to get away from their house and get on an airplane to fly to a conference. But at the end of the day, things are going to change how we do business. I don't care how you cut it. Going forward, it's going to see a significant impact on the remote workforce, just in my world, technology in general.
The only thing that I would add to that, I really liked where Phil was going, and that's retention. So there may be people that you really think they're coming back, but if you don't really think about the possibility of positions turning into a remote position, they literally can go down the street and go to a company that's saying, hey, we're going to do this, and actually use that as a way to attract talent. So I know that there are many of you saying, well, we just can't do that, and that's fine, but then it goes back to the point of communicating. We've thought about it, we've considered it, and here's why we can't. Because if we don't do that, they'll go somewhere else.
Hey, Kelly. I'm done hijacking it.
All righty, so let's move on here. This one is going to be for Tom. Thank you all for all that great input there. It says, I just watched another webinar and it was stated that if we were granted the PPP loan that we cannot use the employee retention credit as well. Is this not correct?
No, that is correct. If you are using the PPP loan, you cannot use the employer retention credit. The change that was made this week, and maybe what you're getting confused on, is there's two provisions there, the employee retention credit and also the ability to defer payment of the employer piece of the Social Security tax out to 50% at the end of 2021, 50% at the end of 2022. It was in relationship to the deferral of the Social Security tax where the FAQ that was just released in the past couple of days shed some new light, stating that you are allowed to defer that from March 27th to the date that your PPP loan forgiveness is granted. But the webinar that the listener attended that said you cannot use the employer retention credit with the PPP loan, that is accurate.
Okay, thank you, Tom. And this one is for either Steve or Chad. It says, are you saying that the 25% for rent and utilities for PPP loan doesn't have to be spent in the 8 weeks? Is it still forgivable at that point?
Chad, you want that?
I'll give it a shot. Again, I kind of think we're mixing apples and oranges. The 8-week forgiveness, is largely payroll driven and based on what's incurred and expended during that period. After the fact, the residual can be used on any allowable cost, but it does not have an impact on the forgiveness. So after the 8-week measurement period for forgiveness, you can use the cost on any allowable item under the terms of the loans, but it does not impact the forgiveness. That only is measured 8 weeks after the date of the loan. I don't know if I confuse things or help, Steve, so let me know if you think, try to add something there.
No, I think we're saying it right, and I think one of the things we need to make sure we clarify here too is this is a big portion of the CARES Act, the PPP the loan, that is still not 100% clear. We're still interpreting a lot of what has been put out there and trying to determine how to calculate forgiveness. There's different options available. It says it's at the choice of the borrower. We'll see how that really plays out. But the 8-week covered period for the forgiveness is really based off of payroll. They're just saying that you have to spend at least 75% on payroll costs to be eligible for forgiveness. I think that's what it's saying. To even be considered for 100% forgiveness, you got to be over that 75%. But the money is eligible to be used for rent and some of the other qualified costs that we've talked about. If you don't get the max forgiveness, there's still funds left over after that 8 weeks. You can use them towards other eligible costs like rent, interest on mortgages, retirement benefits, those types of things, any other payroll.
And I think it's also important to note that after that 8-week period, basically that's a 1% loan on those expenditures.
Yeah, cheap money.
All right, and this is another 8-week question as well. It says, is the 8-week period for PPP forgiveness a hard timeline? We have some items that are monthly and may not quite align.
So what it says is that that 8-week period, which is pretty definitive, that it's actually 8 weeks, begins on the day you receive your funds. So knowing based off of, I believe Tom was talking about this maybe a little bit earlier, that you do have a little bit of a period from when you are accepted, when your loan application's accepted, you're going to get your funds, then you have to schedule a time to sign the loan documents, and until settlement happens, you have a couple days in there. Because I think that's a little unknown, that maybe your actual payments might fall outside of those 8 weeks. Maybe you can play with those days a little bit to get that 8-week period to cover the majority of your costs that you're going to incur. The wording does say incurred, so you might have an argument you can make too, like if your payment doesn't happen until like the day after those 8 weeks, that it actually was for the 4 weeks prior to that payment was made. It's going to come down to semantics at that point, and the banks will be driving a lot of what the forgiveness calculations are going to look like. So definitely be talking to your lender.
Alrighty, and this next one's going to be for Tom. It says, in prior town hall meetings, you had mentioned a disaster recovery credit that could be taken out on our business tax return for the COVID-19 expenses, i.e. extra equipment we have to have purchased, go to meeting licenses, etc. Could you elaborate on this topic and provide the correct name for this credit?
Sure. Number one, it's not a credit, it's a deduction. This is not something that's unique to the COVID-19 situation. The Qualified Disaster Recovery Program is something that can be invoked anytime there is, some sort of a natural disaster throughout the U.S. It's usually segregated to just that specific geographic area, such as a tornado or hurricane or such. In this case, because the president did declare a national emergency, anywhere in the U.S. is available for this program. Now, what this is saying is it gives you as the employer to pay on behalf of your employees expenses that in normal times would be taxable to the employee. Examples of that are you may be buying over-the-counter drugs for them that don't fit in the health plan. They may not be covered in the health plan. You may pay for some renovations to their home to get it ready to be able to allow them to work remotely because they're at a stay-at-home order. All those sort of things that if you can prove these were expenses that you paid on your employee's behalf related to this situation, you can take a tax deduction for them. Now remember, it's a deduction, not a credit, and I'll explain that in a second. And the employee doesn't have to pick it up as taxable income. Now, if you're incurring expenses that belong to you as the employer, such as you buy additional laptops and you disperse them to your employees to take home to work with, but they still remain the property of the company, you really don't even need this provision to be able to obviously deduct those. That's company equipment. You can write them off. You can depreciate them just as you would if the employee was using them in the office. So it's really those things that are more of a personal nature that you're buying on behalf of the employee to ease their personal situation. And when I say it's a deduction, not a credit, I know we get mixed up on that often. deductions carry a value to you of whatever your effective tax rate is. So if you're in the 25% tax rate and you spend $1 on a deduction, you save 20, you lower your tax bill by 25%. Credit, which we talked about, all these payroll credits and such, credits offset taxes dollar for dollar. So a credit is a little bit more powerful than a deduction, but the deduction is certainly beneficial as well.
All right, Tom, this is another one for you relating to the stimulus payments. If you already filed 2019 taxes, will they look at 2019 or 2018 for stimulus payments?
Yeah, they will look at the most recently filed return. So if your 2019 return has been filed and accepted, they are going to look at the 19 return. That's why, as I alluded to earlier, if you know you've had a jump in income from 18 to 19 and it pushes you over the payment threshold, you may want to hold off on the 19 return. Now, I know a lot of people, are pretty prompt and they got their returns filed in February, maybe early March, before they even had any idea this program was going to come into play. And unfortunately, it might be too late for them.
All righty. And Steve, I know this one has probably been answered before, but just for you to reiterate it for the group, how do we calculate full-time employees for the PPP forgiveness?
Algebra. No, it's full-time employee calculation. And Kristi, you might even be better off to answer this. From what I can tell, it's your typical normal calculation based on the hours of the week. So whatever you determine a full-time person is in your organization, you just take anybody that works less and that percentage of a full-time. Kristi, can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, typically you take all the wages and divide it by the average hours, like you said, whether it's 40 or 35 or whatever, and come up with the full-time equivalent.
Thank you, Steve and Kristi. Another one for either Steve or Chad. We have a common controlled LLC that owns property that our S-Corp leases space in. The S-Corp got the PPP loan. Can we use loan proceeds to cover this rent for only for mortgage interest for the LLC?
Well, that's a good question. This comes down to the affiliation rules within the SBA. That's a whole other set of rules that companies have to follow. And not knowing that off the top of my head, I would probably suggest the conservative approach for maybe calculating this out, or giving us an opportunity to look deeper into that to give you the real answer on the affiliation rules. But there's a potential there that you couldn't claim that rent, and that you would have to pull in that other LLC, which probably has no employees, and maybe use the interest on that mortgage over there. But I couldn't answer that with 100% confidence because I'm not that sure of the affiliation rules at this point.
All righty, and another PPP question. If our business is still operational and bringing in revenue, although much less than typical, and we have received a PPP, can we use the PPP funds to pay payroll first and then use our reduced revenues we have coming in to pay beyond what the PPP would cover? Or save those revenues until we get beyond the 8-week period, as it appears we will be more than 8 weeks to get back to normal revenue to maintain staff?
Do you want me to give you a break on that one?
Yeah, go for it. I had an answer, but
okay.
I want to hear yours. It's probably better.
Oh, well, if you want to go for it.
You got it.
The way I'm interpreting it is they're not requiring you to trace the dollars so much as just validate that you have spent at least this amount of money during the period on payroll. So they're not necessarily saying you got to segregate the funds and use it, just as long as you hit those metrics, the 75%, 25% payroll, non-payroll split. So they're not necessarily forcing your hand on how to use which funds for which expense. So
How do our notes compare, Steve? Nope, that's pretty much dead on. I think the potential confusion could be that we had in previous sessions made a suggestion that for some companies it might make sense to have a separate account to hold those funds and then spend them out of that account to make it easy to trace. So to clarify that suggestion is that's really for companies that struggle to track expenses, that maybe don't have a very robust accounting system, so that you actually have an actual bank account with actual transactions that are easy to trace and prove. But like you said, Chad, 100% right. You just need to make sure that the dollar amount that you have in a loan is spent on eligible expenses. So whether you use funds as long as you use funds to pay those costs, where they came from really isn't going to matter, as long as they're spent on the eligible cost. Because any money that you can't spend on an eligible cost has to go back. I don't think anybody will have trouble spending money though.
Alrighty. Well, I think that we are at the end of our 2 hours here. So, Tom, did you have any closing remarks?
Sure. Again, thank you to all the panelists again today, and thank you for all of us for joining us. I know these 2 hours seem to go by quickly every week, and there's so many questions, and any that we weren't able to address either on the air or with questions directly back to you while we progress today, we certainly will be addressing those, and we will get those answers out to you as the week goes by. So again, thank you for joining us. Please join us again next week. I'm sure we'll have a lot of more information. It seems like every day we just get a little bit more guidance and a little bit more guidance on all these programs. Sometimes that can be frustrating that we don't get it all at one time, but we know all of this is certainly new for the regulators as well. And as questions come to them, we appreciate the fact that they're answering them and giving us guidance that we can share with all of you. So keep those communication lines open. Please don't wait till next Tuesday. If you have a question, reach out to us in the interim, and we certainly will get back to you. As we said many times, keep an eye on all of our resources at Stambaugh Ness, our website, our social media channels, and such, and look for announcements of any other upcoming events that we will be planning and certainly reacting to if need be, if things change. So with that, we'll say goodbye for another week, and we hope to see you again next Tuesday, April 21 at 2 p.m. Eastern. Thanks, everyone.